Someone asked me to do a video on my history with Islam and why I chose to become a Muslim. Without going into too much detail, there was a point in my life where things were pretty bleak and pretty checkered, pretty dark. And by curious chance, I ended up in prison, sharing a cell with a Muslim who I'd known before being incarcerated, a guy I knew very well. And when you're on remand, you are locked up pretty much for 23 to 23 and a half hours a day. When you're in a very small kind of 8 by 12 foot cube box, you get to know a human being very, very well. And I was explaining to Khan, I said, you know, I'd lost complete direction. I was emotionally and my mental health was pretty poor at the time, and I was searching for something. I was searching for something to give me guidance, something to give me my focus back. So he gave me a little copy of the Quran, and I started to read it. I've still got it to this day. And there were lots of it that made sense. Over the coming years, I convert. Well, you revert into Islam, you don't convert. Everybody is born with Allah in their heart, and as you grow up, you distance yourself from him, and part of the process is to come back to God. I found a great deal of hope and positivity in what I was doing. I was at my local mosque 4 or 5 days a week. And for a brief period, life was pretty cool. It was pretty good. I'd got some foundation. You know, there's lots within the Quran that is very beautiful. You know, it's about, you know, spiritual growth and growth as a human being and what you can do for your brothers and sisters. But slowly I started to see that there's a huge amount of division within the religion. And the more you start studying the Quran and the more you start studying the Hadiths, you start to realise that from the Christian background that I came from, and the fact that I remember as a child going to Sunday school at the Little Over Methodist church not too far from where my parents lived, you start to realise that it's very difficult to compare, you know, a sandal wearing long-haired hippie that flip-flopped his way around the desert preaching peace and love to a man who was a fucking warlord who was married more times than a Hollywood A-lister. You know, you start to think, hang on a minute. I started to notice this division between the believer and the non-believer. I started to realise that through the Quran, the term kafir is used over 420 times. And I asked imams on a regular basis, you know, why, if Islam is so inclusive, if Islam is so sharing and about love and peace, why is there this massive division between the believer and the non-believer? And I was never given an answer. I was just patted on the head and told that, you know, it was beyond my understanding. We used to have a kind of regular preachers that would come on, I think, if memory serves me right, it was Wednesday or Thursday evenings, and I started to notice that towards the end of 2004, the rhetoric of these guys was very anti-West, and how that Islam was under attack and that we had to be prepared for the fight. I also noticed that there's quite a lot of racism within that, and I'd regularly hear the excuse of, oh, it's okay, Drew, it's not like you, you know, you're one of us. Excuse me? And I started to just feel uncomfortable. I started to feel as though this wasn't what I'd been sold. Subsequently, the individual that introduced me to Islam, my good friend Khan, I found had been disowned from his family because he'd decided to walk away from Islam. He didn't want to engage his daughters. He wanted it to be their choice. He'd had his own issues. And this is a guy that came from a predominantly conservative, devout Muslim family. So the foundations that, you know, I'd started to build a life on had been smashed to pieces on that decision of him alone. And I started to think, well, hang on a minute, what else have I been sold that's not quite right? I'd kept my faith very secretive from lots of people in my life. Even the person I was with at the time, the girl I was with at the time, knew very little. I'd make excuses, you know, why I was going out, and you know, that left me feeling again very uncomfortable. Why couldn't I be honest about it? And then the decision for leaving came shortly after the tragic events in London, the 7/7 bombings. And I'm not saying that this was all Muslims, because it wasn't, I promise you. But there was almost this acceptance of, there was an element of it that was acceptable and was what the West deserved. Now, I'm not saying that our foreign policy is without faults, because it's pretty much based upon crappy decisions and lots of mistakes. But do I believe that targeting innocent people was acceptable? Absolutely not. It was a cowardly act that still resonates to this day. I started doing a lot more research, and to give you a little bit of background, you know, I've suffered with severe depression and borderline bipolar for many years. I'm not medicated. I found a way to manage my condition because I was diagnosed quite late with a rare form of super high functioning autism, where, you know, I have quite a substantively high IQ, but I find certain social situations very difficult. I find reading social cues incredibly hard. But one of the things, the positives of my condition, is I throw myself into stuff at 1,000 miles an hour. I want to learn as much as I could. And the more I read of the Quran, the more I read of the Hadiths, I noticed that there was a lot of hypocrisy. A lot of it didn't make sense. A lot of it was contradictory. A lot of it didn't toe the pattern that I was expecting. And a good example of this, for example, is if you ask your average person in the street, is it okay for a devout Muslim to drink alcohol? The vast majority of people would say, no, you know, of course it isn't. If you asked a Muslim, they'd probably say that. But then we look at the likes of Mohammed Atta, who was one of the guys that flew the planes into the World Trade Center. He was allegedly known to use cocaine in the days leading up to 9/11. He was drinking in strip clubs. And if you don't understand Islam, it's very difficult for you to make that link. But, for example, in the Quran it says that thou shalt not drink from the grape. It's not the direct interpretation, but that's basically what it says. Thou shalt not drink from the grape. Your more Wahhabist, far-right kind of sheer interpretation of that is literal. It's not to drink wine. But it makes your mates Jim Beam and Jack Daniels perfectly acceptable guys to knock around with. Whereas the more progressive Muslims have interpreted that as, well, no, what actually Allah was saying is that we shouldn't drink alcohol. So you see this conflict between the devout and far right and the progressive actually swapping stances. And this is part of the thing that kind of made me think, hang on, this just isn't making sense. Then I started looking into Islamic countries around the world, and it left me cold. It left me absolutely cold. And the fact of the matter is, you know, women being stoned to death for adultery because they've been victims of rape, I'm not prepared to accept that. Men being murdered for being suspected homosexuals under Sharia law, I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with the rape crisis that we've had in the UK that the mainstream media are terrified to be honest about. I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with the division that's taking place between the left and right in the UK, and the fact that the liberal left seem to ignore the crimes of Islam. I'm not anti-Islam, but I believe religion should be a choice. you can choose to or choose not to, and you shouldn't be punished or victimized for deciding either way. If you want to believe in a God, well, then that's your God-given right, in theory. I know there's an irony to that, but in a free democratic country, that's your right. But it shouldn't be law. There was a reason why in the UK we separated church from state, and there's a good reason for that, and that reason continues to resonate perfectly to this day. The problem is, in Islamic countries, that isn't the case, and Sharia is gospel. You know, it is the letter and how it's lived. And the fact is that Islam hasn't seen any kind of progression of scripture since the Quran was first written. The point is, I learnt about Islam from the inside. And I object to people who, I guarantee in the comments of this video, will level the same standard pejoratives that I'm a racist. No, I'm not. I'm just anti-Islam. I don't like dangerous ideologies. Scientology, Catholicism, Mormonism. I think all religions have a poisonous aspect to them, where conformity and the rule of the rhetoric is paramount. I don't think it's even possible these days to compare the Bible and the Quran. There are lots of similarities, but the fact of the matter is the Bible was watered down over many hundreds of years to make it more palatable, to make it easier to sell, because fundamentally it was a PR exercise. Let's get more people into Christianity, which was one of the reasons that it was watered down in the manner that it was. But we are seeing a position now where we are surrounded by a mainstream media, particularly the BBC, that's the king of the Islamic sycophants, that will not report honestly, that will not tell us the truth. I'm more than happy for anybody to engage in their religious practices, but what I do think is important is that the rights of everybody within that democratic society need to be respected, and that's something that we are seeing in this country isn't happening. That there is a problem with multiculturalism, particularly with the Islamic community, and as my good friend Khan would say, he says every single Muslim is progressive until the front door is closed. And I never really got what he meant by that, you know, whatever the 15 years ago when he first said that to me. Now I get it. Because if you understand anything about the Islamic faith, you can't criticise any aspect of it. Because if you do, under Sharia law, that's the death penalty. End of story. That's the death penalty. You cannot criticise it. It's the reason why you will never, ever, ever see a Muslim denounce Sharia law on any form of public record. Because they can't. You know, it's within the scriptures of Islam. You know, Allah and Muhammad's words are final. And it doesn't help with the likes of CNN Sally, the legendary lesbian who says that Sharia law is empowering to feminism. Feminism is a whole new video, which I will do eventually. No, it's not. It's the most oppressive ideology on the planet. And the fact that we have, you know, over 10 countries that punish by death homosexuality, that will stone a woman to death for being a victim of rape. This is not something that is compatible with the West. It just isn't, and that's got nothing to do with race. And I'm sick and tired of lazy, ignorant, unintelligent people trying to claim that attacking an ideology makes you a racist. No, the clue's in the title, you fucking morons. Ideology. It's an idea, and no idea is beyond reproach, beyond challenge. The fact that a woman's testimony under Sharia law is 50% of that of a man. So she's fucked from the beginning. She has no justifiable right to be on equal footing. And we've worked incredibly hard in the West to have the same rights, regardless of sexuality, gender, sexual preference, any of this. We've worked incredibly hard to have a society that actually is pretty equal. You know, we're seeing now record numbers of people from ethnic backgrounds, whether that be Afro-Caribbean, African, Chinese, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, record numbers attaining successful grades at GCSE, going on to do A-levels, going on to higher education. In fact, statistically, by percentage, they are doing far, far better than their white counterparts. And that's a great thing. It's a great thing. Of course it is. But I will oppose Islam in its current state until it globally and collectively progresses itself and catches up with the rest of the world. I will not tolerate being called a racist because I oppose an ideology. In the same way, I think Scientology should be banned, but no one will call me a racist for that. But if I say in its current form Islam should be banned, there'll be a whole host of liberal, leftist, unintelligent, ill-informed morons calling me a fucking racist. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of it. I've got no interest in skin colour. Ironically, Khan, my good friend, I'm the equivalent of a godfather to his 2 Indian daughters, and I would do anything for those girls. I haven't seen them for a long time, but if the need ever arose, I would be there because I made a promise to that man, and that promise means something to me. The colour of their skin is of no interest to me. But being corrupted by an ideology that is fundamentally dangerous in its current form is something that we should all be frightened of. Thanks for listening, guys.